Sam.
My parents came from Sicily originally in 1921. Okay. But they were not married. They came, they didn't know each other until they got here. My father, previous to that, when he was young, he spent his teenage years in Argentina growing up. The first 12 years he was in Sicily, and then my grandfather took him to Argentina with the intention of moving the family there. Well, he stayed there 8 years and the family never moved over there. So he went back for a visit to visit back in Sicily because he wanted to stay in Argentina. Well, that was when World War I broke out and he got nabbed, and the next 5 years were spent in the Alps fighting, in World War I. So after the war, my grandfather died of the 1918 influenza epidemic. So he stayed there for a couple of years, but there wasn't any work in Sicily. So an uncle that lived there, he had moved to North America, okay, and he lived in Philadelphia. And he said, my father had every intention of going back to Argentina, but he talked him into coming to Philadelphia, and that's where he first landed. Then he had another uncle that lived up in Fulton, New York, and so when he first came here, he worked in the oil refinery in Philadelphia, and he didn't like the inside work. So up in Fulton, New York, they had farms, and my father liked that. He liked being the outdoor type. So he went up to stay with the other uncle up in Fulton. In the meantime, my mother, who lived in a adjacent town there in Sicily, she had a sister in Fulton, okay, and she went there for a visit. She had no intention of immigrating. She just went up for a visit. Well, she lived across the street to where my father's uncle lived, so they got to know each other, and next thing you know, they got married, and they lived here ever since in this country. And my dad, he lived in Fulton there for 60 years.
And never thought of himself as an American? Is that what you were saying?
No, he was still an Italian. He was an Italian living in America,
felt like
right?
He was an American.
Yeah, well, he was a naturalized citizen, and my mother was too. But his heritage was Italy, okay? And I mean, this wasn't his home country, right?
He's been 60 years.
He lived 105. And
Where was he buried?
Huh?
Where was he buried?
Up in New York.
In New York. We didn't bring his ashes back to Italy.
No, they were buried there.
Because you brought your father's ashes back to Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, but like I say,
But if you go back in history, okay, the Spaniards, when Columbus landed here, they didn't come here to settle and be Americans, right? They came here to exploit the country and bring the stuff back to their country, right? And the only ones that came here, like the Pilgrims, right? They came here because of religious persecution in England, and I guess
But Sam, did your parents want you guys to be American, or did he want you to go back to Italy?
No, he wanted us to stay here and be Americans.
But he himself was not going to be an American.
No, he figures he'd never be an American because his culture was different.
Oh. How about you, Shirley? How did your family come here?
Well, my grandparents came from Italy. I had one set that came from Rome. That was my father's father and mother. My grandfather came here and then went back to Italy and got my grandmother and I had two aunts, two small girls when he came back. And he also had most all had relatives here that they had to have sponsors, so he came and had some. We don't know. They didn't talk much about their background. And then my mother's parents came from Naples, and so they same thing. They were, in the other way, in one way, they were very much American. They didn't want ever go back or anything like that, but they still kept their Italian culture. They spoke Italian, although the kids, but they wanted, my father and my mother, both sides, they sent them to school, wanted them to speak English and be American, you know, American that way. But as far as their own culture, they kept their language. My grandmother kept hers somewhat on my mother's side, and my grandfather spoke mostly Italian, but we could. Well, I didn't learn to speak much Italian. I could understand some, but we could communicate with him. He could speak enough English. I mean, I could communicate with both sides.
Where did you grow up?
In Syracuse, on the west end of Syracuse, and there were lots of
New York.
Italian.
And you were in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
and your family...
When they first came, they went in Cambridge, and because, well, most of the cities, they all had their own little groups.
Yeah.
And everyone there spoke Italian,
Yeah.
the stores, everything, so they didn't have a problem with language.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then
My
when they
parents-
moved,
Yeah.
They wouldn't
move out
speak
of there, then you
English
have a problem,
at home.
because not everyone is speaking your language.
Yeah.
So you need to learn the language of the country that you're there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your parents did not speak English?
My parents spoke English, not my grandparents.
Your grandparents were the first.
They were the first, and
So
they
your
spoke
parents
some.
would be the first generation. Would that be the way you would count it? Your
They're
parents, so
the
you're
first
second.
generation.
Okay.
And so they were born here, and they were encouraged to go to school, get as much education. But the Syracuse area was a industrial town. There were all kinds of places to work. Like they had 3 potteries in Syracuse. They had Syracuse China, Iroquois China, and Onondaga China. So the immigrants that came into Syracuse, the grandparents, and my grandfather came in, he worked on the railroad, and it's also in Syracuse. They had salt mines, had a lot of things, for places for a lot of industry for immigrants to work in. And of course, with so many, there would be like, say, groups of sections, Italian sections and all that, so they had no problem having friends or having people to communicate with. And they would use, the children more would be their, what would you call them, interpreters. When they had to do something that they didn't understand, they would, like my mother or my aunts or uncles would